The square of Red Hollow lay under red dust, the scorching noon heat frozen in place as the wagon wheels ground to a stop. Evelyn, a 23-year-old black woman, stepped down, gripping the strap of her leather bag tight. The whole town fell silent, watching the young teacher with eyes half curious, half skeptical, until the piercing cry of a little girl tore the silence apart. From the shadows came Silas McKenna, the scarred man feared by the town. He lifted the child, wiped the blood with an old cloth, leaving behind a silence as heavy as stone. When he turned to walk away, a flash of silver gleamed from his vest pocket, a plain round watch Evelyn had once seen in her father's hand. Her heart clenched. In this unfamiliar land, why was her family's only keepsake resting with a man rumored to bear a dark past? Could it be that Red Hollow was not just a place to teach letters, but a place hiding secrets powerful enough to alter the course of her fate? The stagecoach gave one last jolt before coming to a halt in the red-dusted square of Red Hollow. The clatter of hooves against the hardened ground rang out like the tolling of a bell, heralding a beginning both longed for and uncertain. Evelyn Moore drew in a steady breath, her fingers tightening on the strap of her worn leather satchel. The long journey from Iowa had left her body weary to the bone, yet in her eyes flickered the quiet steel of someone well accustomed to standing tall beneath unwelcoming stares. The 23-year-old, her skin a smooth, deep brown, stepped down from the coach. Her dark green dress, faded by years, but pressed with care, swayed gently. A wide-brimmed sun hat, secured with a frayed ribbon, shaded her face. As her boot struck the ground, dust rose in a thin veil, drifting like smoke. Evelyn lifted her gaze and met the sight of an entire town watching. That noon in Red Hollow, hands stilled. The man leaning against the saloon post ceased tapping his cigar against his heel. The grocer's wife froze mid-measure over the flour scale, eyes narrowing behind round spectacles. Children peeked out from behind door frames, whispering through the cracks. No voice welcomed her, yet no one turned away. They stared at her with looks half curious, half wary, as though the arrival of a young black schoolteacher was something no one had reckoned with. Evelyn breathed slow, her stride even. She had known this sort of reception since girlhood. In Iowa, at railway depots, in quiet farm towns she had passed through. Silence could weigh heavier than whispers. But within, she clung to a steady thought. She had not come seeking approval. She had come to sow letters into the hands of children who needed them. She had barely crossed a few paces when a sudden cry split the stillness. A small girl, 6, maybe 7, tripped and fell hard across the road. Her knee scraped against the rough ground, leaving a raw streak of red. The child screamed, her voice echoing sharp through the hushed square. Her mother rushed out, skirts sweeping dust, calling her name again and again. The crowd stirred, murmurs swelling, but before anyone moved, a shadow stepped free of the saloon's porch. A man in a long black duster strode forward, his boots striking heavy and unhurried, like the drumbeat of some approaching reckoning. The air shifted. Evelyn felt the ripple pass across every face around her. An old woman muttered, "It's him," and yanked her grandson back. A few young men frowned, eyes lit with a mix of fear and challenge. Even the child's mother faltered, caught between rushing in and retreating, her feet rooted to the ground. The man knelt. Without a word, he lifted the little girl into arms strong but careful. Her sobs dwindled into hiccuped whimpers. From his pocket, he drew a worn handkerchief, dabbing away dirt and blood with slow, practiced hands. The girl grew quiet, burying her face against his chest as if it were the safest place she'd ever known. The man, Silas McKenna, after wiping the dirt and blood from the child's knee, gave the mother only the smallest nod before turning away. The long hem of his black duster swept through the red dust, leaving behind a dark, heavy shroud in the air. No one dared call him back, nor did anyone step closer. Only whispers trailed after him, stringing through the square like thin wires wrapping around Evelyn. That's the scarred one. The man who lost everything in the Kansas fire. Best not go near him. The broken fragments of voices cut sharp as knives. Evelyn stood still, her eyes fixed on the broad back receding into the row of weather-worn buildings. Her hand trembled, not from the fear that gripped the townsfolk, but because in that brief moment she had glimpsed something familiar. A silver watch glinted from the pocket of the vest beneath his black coat. Her heart tightened. That watch. She had stared at it countless times in her father's hand. It was no treasure in the worldly sense, just a round-faced piece, its dial yellowed with age, its lid engraved with simple designs. Yet to her family, it was the only keepsake her father had ever carried back from his years of labor in the East. When he died, the memory of that watch became the one thread binding Evelyn to his image. And now, here it was, in this strange land, resting with a man the town whispered about in fear. Why him? Evelyn forced a slow breath. It was no accident. Life had rarely given her lovely coincidences. Things came instead as trials, reminders that she must step farther, look closer. And she knew Red Hollow would not simply be a place to teach children their letters. It had already become the soil where some door to her past was waiting to be forced open. The crowd dispersed, drifting back to their tasks, though eyes still clung to the young teacher who had just arrived. Evelyn lifted her satchel and walked on, her skirt brushing through the brittle dust. In her mind, her father's voice rose, low, warm, yet faint, as it had been near the end. Evie May, if you ever see this watch again, believe that I am still somewhere near, walking with you. She gripped the strap tighter, as if holding fast to that fragment of memory suddenly set alight. As she neared the boarding house, a squat two-story frame at the far end of the street, Evelyn cast one last look toward the path Silas had vanished down. The broad shoulders, the hat pulled low to shadow half his face, and most of all, that gleam of silver shining from his vest pocket, all of it lingered sharp in her mind. Part of her longed to run after him, to demand, "Why do you have it? Who was my father to you?" But reason held her back. This was her first day in Red Hollow, and already she had felt the fragility of her standing. A young black woman, alone, without kin to anchor her. She could not afford to make herself a greater subject of gossip than she already was. She stepped into Hoth, the boarding house where lamplight spread warm gold across the low-beamed ceiling. The landlady, Margaret Keene, a widow, looked up. At first her gaze was appraising, then slowly shifted to a guarded welcome. "Miss Moore, I take it? I was told a new schoolteacher was coming." Her voice was rough, but carried a hardness honed by years of solitude, like a block of timber weathered against storms. Evelyn gave a slight smile, lowering her head in greeting. Setting down her bag, she sat on the wooden chair near the window. Outside, dusk settled, washing the square in deep violet. Thin columns of kitchen smoke rose, mixing with the scents of dust and horse. A small town, closed in, governed by unwritten rules no newcomer could yet fathom. And yet, among all these unfamiliar things, the silver watch burned brightest in her mind, a small flame flickering against the night. Evelyn asked herself, Who was Silas McKenna, truly? The scarred man, the one whispered to have lost everything. What tie bound him to her father? And why, in the instant he held the child, had his eyes not been cold as the stories claimed, but filled instead with a hollow emptiness she could not name? She pressed her palm against her chest, feeling the hurried beat within. Could it be that her journey to Red Hollow was never only about teaching, but about reclaiming a fragment of her family's past? From the street came the fading echo of hooves. A draft swept through the cracks, rattling the lamp's flame. Evelyn closed her eyes, letting herself drift into the weight of unanswered questions. In her thoughts, the image of the silver watch gleamed steady, reminding her that the road ahead would hold more than chalk and dust. It would carry secrets strong enough to change the course of her heart. Her first night in Red Hollow slipped by in uneasy rest. The wind hissed through the siding, dogs barked faintly in the distance, and now and again the voices of the townsfolk returned in echo. That's the scarred one, the man who lost everything. Evelyn turned on the narrow bed, whispering to herself, "But he carries my father's watch." The words circled her mind, pulling her down into sleep heavy with fractured images, a hand reaching out from fire, a face cloaked in shadow, and the sudden flare of silver breaking through smoke. Morning would bring Red Hollow its first lessons. But for Evelyn, the truest lesson had already begun, with that single glimpse of a silver watch. A lesson of trust, of the tether between past and present, and of a man named Silas McKenna. The two-story wooden house of the widow Margaret Keene stood on the eastern edge of town, right where the dirt road spilled out toward fallow fields. Its timbers were weathered gray, the low porch mottled with moss, yet inside everything was neat, ordered, and clean. Evelyn followed her hostess across the creaking floorboards, the hush of the place like a heavy curtain, closed off but offering a fragile kind of peace after the long, jolting ride. Margaret, past 50, was broad-shouldered, her figure carrying the weight of many hard winters. Her movements were slow, deliberate. Her face bore the stern lines of survival, her brown eyes clouded like cracked glass, watchful, yet carrying the muted kindness of someone long accustomed to sheltering strangers. "Your room's upstairs, end of the hall," she said, her voice husky, clipped. The room was small but bright. A wooden bed with an old mattress lay dressed in a clean white sheet. Beside the window stood a table and a chair. Pale curtains of yellow muslin shimmered in the last of the sun, softening the space with unexpected warmth. Evelyn set down her bag and lowered herself to the bed. The mattress dipped, cradling her until her weary body nearly sank into its quiet relief. In that moment, Iowa came rushing back. The brick cottage, the endless winters bleached in white, where even silence seemed to have its own whisper. She remembered the narrow attic where she had read by lamplight from the few books her father had managed to borrow. That old solitude now returned, yet here it was cloaked in a new shape, a western town that had already judged her by the shade of her skin. Margaret lingered in the doorway, hands clasped at her apron. "You're the new school teacher, aren't you? Folks said you came from Iowa." Evelyn gave a small nod. "Yes, my name is Evelyn Moore." The widow's head dipped in acknowledgement before she stepped in to straighten the curtain, as if by habit. After a long pause, her voice lowered, near a whisper. "Miss Moore, in Red Hollow there are two camps. The merchants here in town and the ranchers out on the range. They don't much care for each other. Each is waiting for the other to stumble. You'll need to tread careful." Evelyn lifted her eyes to meet the gaze of that weather-scarred woman. Margaret's words paused, then carried on. "And Silas McKenna, He stands outside of it all. Folks fear him, but they're curious too. Some say he carries scars. Some say he lost his wits in the fire. And there are those who swear he's killed a man. But no one can tell truth from tale. The room, already quiet, grew heavier still. Evelyn dropped her gaze, hiding the tremor that name had stirred. That figure, that face, and above all, the flash of the silver watch beneath his coat, remained circling in her mind. Yet she spoke nothing. Margaret left her then, and Evelyn was alone. Outside, the light faded, draping Red Hollow's roofs in purple shade. From her little room, she could hear the wind whining through the boards, dogs barking far off, and at times the coarse laughter rolling from the saloon across the square. She sat at the small table and opened her notebook. The first words wavered onto the page. First day in Red Hollow. They looked at me as a stranger, but I have known that look before. What I cannot quiet is the silver watch. Why is it here? Why does it rest with a man named Silas McKenna? The ink bled into a blot. Evelyn closed the book, laid it down, and drew the curtain. Beyond the glass, a few lamps burned scattered in the dirt street, casting broken patches of yellow. Off in the west, she caught a faint light flickering, perhaps from a ranch along the horizon where the trees cut the sky. Perhaps Broken Bluff, where Silas lived. The thought made her shiver. A man feared and revered in equal measure, carrying the last relic of her father. Evelyn pressed her brow to the cold frame. Is it chance? Or is Providence forcing me to face what I left behind? Darkness spread, filling every corner. She turned back to the bed and lit the small oil lamp on the table. Its amber glow washed over the rough ceiling, reminding her of winters in Iowa. But there was no cough of her father in the corner, no mother's hand sewing a worn hem. Only Evelyn, alone in the small room of a town that was not hers. Yet the silence was not wholly frightening. It felt instead like a pause, a breath between doors. One closing behind, another not yet opened. She lay on her side, eyes fixed on the faint glimmer beyond the window, whispering to herself, "Tomorrow I begin. The children must learn, and I must live, no matter how heavy the secrets." The flame of the lamp wavered, then steadied. In its warmth, Evelyn drifted toward sleep, carrying with her a single image bright and unyielding, the cold face of Silas McKenna and the silver gleam of the watch in his vest. The small schoolhouse of Red Hollow sat on the southern corner of the square, a single-room wooden structure, its tin roof weathered dull by wind and storm. Inside, the air carried the scent of dry timber mingled with chalk dust, a rustic atmosphere far removed from the classrooms Evelyn had once known in Iowa. Rough-hewn benches filled the room, crowded with pupils of every age. Small children just learning their letters pressed alongside freckled youths with curious, restless eyes. Her first day at the front of the class stirred a nervousness both familiar and new. Evelyn had long grown used to the curiosity and unease her skin drew from others. Yet beneath the wide eyes of these children, she felt both the weight of responsibility and the fragility of her place. Their gazes did not wholly reject her, but neither did they embrace her. She drew a breath, steadying herself with the thought that letters might serve as the bridge, and began with the simplest of lessons. "We will start with the alphabet," she said, her voice firm enough to calm her own trembling. The room echoed with halting recitations, first scattered, then slowly in rhythm. A few of the younger girls smiled shyly under her encouragement, while the older boys met her with doubtful stares. Midway through the lesson, as the class was stringing letters into words, one little girl suddenly lifted her head. Lucy, gold-haired, round blue eyes bright, called out in a clear, ringing voice, "Evie May!" The sound struck Evelyn so sharply, she nearly dropped the chalk in her hand. The class erupted in giggles, thinking it some childish jest. But Evelyn froze, every muscle taut. Evie May. That name, only her mother had ever spoken it, back when she was alive. It was the tender nickname of her childhood in Iowa, whispered when her mother held her close. No one else could have known. Evelyn swallowed hard, steadying her breath. "Lucy," she asked softly, "who taught you to call me that?" The girl twirled her braid, smiling with innocent pride. "Mr. Silas. He said the new teacher has a pretty name, Evie May. He said so, didn't he?" A ripple of whispers swept across the room. Children repeated the odd name like a new toy passed hand to hand. Evelyn felt her face grow hot, her pulse pounding in her ears. How could Silas McKenna, whom she had never once spoken to, know the secret name her mother alone had used? It took her a long moment to recover her composure. "In class, you will call me Miss Moore," she said, gentle but firm. The room fell silent, though Lucy continued to hum with daydream, unaware of the storm she had stirred in her teacher's heart. The lesson closed under a strange air. As the children clattered out, Evelyn lingered at her desk, her hands knotted together. Small footsteps padded back. Lucy pressed a purple wildflower into her palm. "I like Evie May better," the child whispered, then skipped away. Evelyn sat still, the flower trembling in her grasp. Outside, the late sun laid a wan yellow across the gray rooftops. Evelyn walked slowly toward the boarding house, the sound of that name echoing in her mind. Each step weighed heavier, haunted by memory. She saw again her first glimpse of Silas in the square, the quiet figure, the hat shadowing his face, the flash of silver at his chest. Now, as if that were not enough, he had trespassed into the most private corner of her past. Back in her small room, Evelyn opened her notebook. Her hand shook, yet she wrote, "Today, a child called me by the name my mother once spoke. Lucy said it came from Mr. Silas. How does he know? Did he once know my family? Or is it some strange coincidence?" Outside the window, she saw again the faint glow from Broken Bluff, Silas's ranch, flickering against the darkening prairie. She rested her chin in her hand, tangled in thoughts. Perhaps he had merely overheard the name, yet perhaps he held more than one secret thread binding him to her father and mother. The wind swept in from the plains, stirring the curtain. Evelyn shut her notebook, pressing her forehead against the cold window frame. Evie May. The whispered name stung her eyes with tears. Could it be that Red Hollow, for all its strangeness and suspicion, was holding an invisible tether between her and the scarred man? That night, Evelyn did not sleep. The ticking of the wall clock beat like the pulse of memory, each sound recalling the silver watch in Silas's vest. Past and present coiled together like a rope she could not untangle. She turned restlessly on her narrow bed, whispering into the dark, "Tomorrow I will find out. One way or another, I must know." Autumn came to Red Hollow in a golden light that spilled wide across the prairie, bending the tall grasses as though they bowed to greet the season. In the fields, pumpkins lay heaped in mounds, ears of corn hung drying beneath cabin eaves, and wreaths of crimson maple leaves adorned the doors of every homestead. The Harvest Festival was the one time each year when the town set aside its hardships, laid down its feuds, and gathered in fleeting joy. Evelyn prepared for the day with all the nervous anticipation of someone newly invited into a community's embrace. She chose her simplest dress, a blue cotton gown, worn but well kept, pinning a small white bow at the collar. Before the mirror, she gathered her hair into a neat bun, revealing a face bronzed by the sun, yet bright with determination. A teacher must be the one to speak first, she told herself, and allowed a quiet smile to steady her resolve. The square that day brimmed with people. Long tables stretched side by side, loaded with pies, sugared candies, apple cider, and roasted meat sending its fragrance into the air. Children darted about with sticks of candy, cheeks flushed red beneath the sun. Grown folk clustered in groups, their laughter filling the air, though when their eyes slid toward Evelyn, there lingered a cautious distance. Yet the children, her pupils, pulled her into their circle of song. Evelyn led them, her voice low but warm, weaving easily with the twang of a banjo from the market corner. The children's voices rose with hers, singing simple lines of harvest, of corn, of the turning of wheat. One by one, the chatter of adults stilled, heads turned to listen. In that instant, Evelyn felt her heart beat in rhythm with the town's, as though she was no longer a stranger, but a thread in this tapestry of peace. Then silence swept the square. The children's chorus faded, and the crowd suddenly parted, eyes drawn toward the dirt road that led into the square. Wooden wheels creaked, hooves struck the earth in measured cadence, and into sight rolled a wagon piled high with golden pumpkins. Holding the reins sat Silas McKenna. His black duster, dulled with road dust, cast his figure in shadow. The wide brim of his hat pulled low across his face, though it could not hide the scars carved along his jaw. Evelyn caught her breath. The air itself seemed to thin, swept clean of noise, until only a dense hush remained. The people of Red Hollow were used to seeing Silas only from afar, passing silent along the street, or glimpsed briefly at the smithy's door. Never had he come to the festival, and now, not only had he appeared, but he had brought a wagon brimming with pumpkins, a gift to the community. A whisper broke from the crowd. "Is he joining us?" Another answered, "Maybe trying to play neighborly," but suspicion still clung to their tones. Silas spoke no word. He drove the wagon to a corner of the square, dismounted, and with quiet strength lifted each pumpkin, setting them onto the common tables. Round and gleaming, they shone like suns of autumn. The act seemed plain enough, yet it bore the weight of an unspoken offering, his silent place among them. Evelyn watched, her chest stirring with something she could not name. She remembered the rumors, that Silas cared for no one, that he lived apart from the world. But before her now was a man who had carried gifts of the harvest to his town, without grandeur or pride, only presence, heavy and undeniable. And then his gaze lifting met hers, just for a moment, but long enough to dissolve the square around her. His eyes, smoke-gray and storm-bound, flickered with something unexpected, not menace but a tacit acknowledgement. Children, free from their elders' judgments, rushed to the wagon, calling for pumpkins. Silas bent slightly, nodding, and passed each one into their hands. A few shrank back at first, but when his hand brushed their hair in a gentle pot, they grinned wide with delight. The crowd looked on, caught between disbelief and the urge to hold on to old fears. Standing among her pupils, Evelyn felt her heart unsteady. She could not look away. The man once feared as untouchable now knelt to wipe mud from a child's cheek. The image cracked the wall of rumor, revealing something fragile, almost tender, beneath. Music struck up again, slow at first, then swelling, lively. Laughter returned, voices lifted, the strain of silence thinning like mist. Yet Evelyn knew Silas's presence at the harvest feast would leave its mark. Red Hollow was not a town to yield its prejudices quickly. She turned back to lead her children in another song, but her mind would not settle. Each glance toward the corner of the square found the dark sweep of that duster, unmissable amid the bright throng. And each time their eyes met, her pulse quickened, pounding like a drum woven into the festival's tune. As the sun sank low, its pale gold stretching across the rooftops, the festival swelled into its merriest hour. Lanterns were strung high, their glow spilling over faces flushed with cider and joy. Evelyn stood among the children, smiling, yet deep within she knew she was being drawn into a new current, one that circled around the name Silas McKenna. The music shifted, banjo and fiddle drawing into a slower rhythm, a waltz seldom heard in a town as small as Red Hollow. Beneath the lanterns strung across the square, couples stepped forward into the open circle, their feet moving light over ground cleared of straw. Evelyn lingered at the edge with her pupils, clapping along to guide their rhythm, though her eyes strayed toward the solitary figure standing apart. Silas stood half-hidden beyond the row of lanterns, smoke-gray eyes fixed somewhere in the music, though not truly listening. The crowd around him had parted instinctively, leaving him in a pocket of space none dared to cross. Evelyn thought she would only glimpse him once or twice more that night, and nothing more. But as the melody stretched long and low, Silas broke through the throng and came directly toward her. Evelyn froze, every eye within reach fastening to her at once, eager to witness what might unfold. "Miss Moore." His voice was low, not loud, yet it carried cleanly in the hush. "Would you grant me a waltz?" His hand extended, large, rough, calloused from years of labor, but the gesture was measured, restrained. Evelyn felt her breath quicken. She had never imagined she would be the first woman Silas McKenna openly asked to dance before the entire town. For a moment she faltered. Around her she sensed the town's anticipation, the mischievous encouragement of her pupils, the mingled doubt and curiosity in the eyes of grown men and women. To refuse would be to deny his presence before them all. To accept would place her at the heart of new whispers. "Yes," she answered softly, laying her hand in his. The clasp was firm, warm. Silas led her to the center of the square, where other pairs were already turning to the tune. The world seemed to blur at the edges. Evelyn heard only her own heartbeat and the weight of his palm against her back, neither too close nor too distant, just steady enough to guide. They began to turn. Each step Silas set was solid, certain, as though he had never forgotten the waltz. Evelyn let herself follow, her skirt flaring light beneath the lantern glow, strands of hair loosening to brush her cheek. She did not look at the crowd. She looked only into his smoke-gray eyes. In them she caught a fleeting softness, tempered by sorrow, a contradiction that pulled her deeper still. Children giggled, a few men whistled in jest, but most adults whispered, voices sharp as needles. Silas McKenna, dancing a waltz. Never seen such a thing. That new teacher, reckless woman. Evelyn heard it all, but forced her heart not to bend. For her, the moment outweighed their judgment. The music carried them around again and again, until Evelyn felt as if her feet no longer touched earth. For the first time since setting foot in Red Hollow, she felt seen, not as the black girl from Iowa, but as a woman invited to dance. And the man who had asked her was none other than Silas McKenna, the Sakasahang, figure both feared and whispered about. When the tune slowed, Silas inclined his head, murmuring just for her, "You dance well." Evelyn's lips curved faintly. "I only followed your lead." A fragile closeness lingered between them, delicate yet undeniable. But then a shadow broke through. A woman in her 30s stepped close, dark cloak drawn, hair styled neat, her face etched with weariness. She brushed past Silas with little notice, leaned near Evelyn, feigning a compliment about her dress. All the while her smile stayed, but her words dropped low, a whisper meant for Evelyn alone. "Be careful. His wife did not die a natural death." The words cut like a blade of ice to the heart. Evelyn stumbled, her steps faltering. The woman slipped away at once, swallowed by the crowd, as if she had never stood there. Evelyn turned toward Silas, but he had noticed nothing, his focus steady on guiding her through the last measures. Only Evelyn's heart quaked. As the music ended, Silas bowed, polite, composed. He returned her to the circle's edge, then walked off into the night as if nothing had passed. Evelyn stood rooted. His warmth still lingered in her hand, yet her mind rang with the whisper. His wife did not die a natural death. The warning planted a seed of suspicion that clashed with the gentleness she had just glimpsed. Margaret Keene appeared beside her, pressing a handkerchief into her palm. "Are you well, Evelyn?" She forced a smile. "Yes." But inside nothing was steady. She scanned the crowd for the stranger, but the lantern light wavered, faces blurred in the throng. No sign remained, only the sharp truth. Someone wished to set her doubting. Later, back at the boarding house, Evelyn sat by her window, hand clutching Margaret's handkerchief until it wrinkled tight. The waltz replayed in her mind, the firm grip, the fleeting softness in his gaze, the turning of the dance. But threaded through it all was the chilling refrain. His wife did not die a natural death. She wondered, had she touched a moment of truth, or stepped into an illusion spun by another's hand? Out across the prairie, the faint glow of Broken Bluff pulsed in the dark. Evelyn pressed her forehead to the pane, whispering into the night, "Silas McKenna, who are you truly?" Rain in Red Hollow was not the rain of Iowa. Here, when the heavy clouds rolled down from the western mountains, the wind screamed and the water fell in sheets, lashing the tin roofs until the mud churned up in violent spray. That day, a sudden storm broke so fierce the rotted roof of Evelyn's schoolhouse gave way with a crash, leaving the room in ruins. By grace, no child was harmed, yet from that day the school was forced to close its doors. Evelyn would not sit idle. She used the lull to visit the homes of her pupils, walking the mire of rain-soaked roads with a basket of bread, a few primers, and small Bibles for the children to keep practicing their letters. She passed through leaning gates, listened to the dogs barking from porch shadows, and received nods from wary parents whose eyes still measured her from a distance. By late afternoon, after leaving the Weber home, Evelyn found her steps drawn northward. Mud clung heavy to her shoes, yet her heart weighed heavier with unanswered questions. The road wound toward Broken Bluff, the great ranch of Silas McKenna. She had not set out with the intent of going there, but her feet carried her. Perhaps it was the lingering echo of their waltz beneath the lanterns, or perhaps the chill whisper of the strange woman still clung to her skin. Something in Evelyn pressed her onward, telling her only by stepping into Silas's world could she learn who he truly was, the man feared and wondered at by all of Red Hollow. The gate stood open. The road stretched between long fences, cattle grazing slow along the wet grass. The air was cool after rain, rich with the scent of earth and green shoots. Evelyn walked carefully, her chest beating fast, as though she trespassed where she ought not. Broken Bluff rose ahead, a house of timber and stone, its steep roof dark, its square windows severe. The place felt both steadfast and cold, like its master. Evelyn knocked. After a moment, Silas appeared, his dark hair damp from rain, a rough towel thrown over his shoulder. For an instant his eyes widened at the sight of her. Then he stepped back in silence to allow her through. "Forgive me for coming unannounced," Evelyn said, her voice unsteady. "I only wished to bring a few books for the children, and to see how you fared after the storm." Silas gave a single nod. Words did not come easily to him. He motioned her inside. The house smelled of smoke and damp earth. Firelight spilled from the kitchen hearth, gilding the hall in amber. Everything was neat, spare, yet shadowed by a loneliness Evelyn could not quite name. He walked ahead, leading her down a long passage. Passing a door left ajar, Evelyn glimpsed the room beyond. Dust filmed the air. A wooden cradle sat abandoned on the floor, its fabric lining torn, its corners webbed in neglect. A faint trace of dried roses lingered in the stale damp. She paused, her hand on the frame, eyes softening. The room carried a weight of longing unfulfilled, left behind as though waiting for someone who never came. At once, Silas strode over and shut the door with a hard snap. The motion was sharp, defensive, almost instinct. His face darkened, jaw set tight. "Just an old room," he said, voice husky. "Nothing worth seeing." Evelyn looked at him, catching in his eyes not anger, but pain sealed deep. She said nothing, but the image of the dust-covered cradle fixed itself in her memory. They shared a plain supper at the fire. Silas's shadow leapt against the wall, throwing his scarred jaw into stark relief. Evelyn sipped her broth, her mind restless. Silas spoke suddenly, as if to himself. "Folks see only the scars. They never see what was lost." The words fell heavy as stone. Evelyn lifted her gaze. His eyes were on the flames, not her. Yet his voice carried a grief that hollowed the air. She longed to ask, to offer some balm, but her lips only parted, no words forming. She let the silence answer for her. The lamp above the table flickered. Evelyn's glance roved the walls until it stopped at a frame above the hearth. Among faded photographs, one seized her breath. Her father and mother, young, smiling, stood beside a soldier. His black hair unscarred, his eyes solemn, steadfast. It was Silas McKenna in his youth. The floor seemed to shift beneath her. There had always been a thread between them, woven long ago, though she had never known. Silas noticed her stare. His head tilted, but he gave no explanation. Instead, he rose, gathered the dishes, and ended the meal in silence. Evelyn sat motionless, hands clenched tight in her lap. That photograph, the abandoned cradle, his words, each a fragment of a truth buried deep. Outside, the rain had eased. The wind brought in the scent of fresh earth. Evelyn rose to leave. Silas did not stop her, only opened the door, his face half-shadowed, half-lit in the moonlight. On the road back to the boarding house, her steps splashed through puddles, yet inside her heart staggered more. The empty room with its cradle, the photograph on the wall, each pressed questions without answers. She knew then, The doubts that haunted her were no longer the town's whispers, but the mystery of her own past, bound somehow to the scarred man of Broken Bluff. At that plain supper, Silas sat in silence before the fire, the trembling glow of the oil lamp casting his shadow sharp against the wall, cutting his features into hard lines. His voice broke the quiet at last, low as wind slipping through a crack in the boards. Folks see only the scars. They never see what was lost. The words fell short, yet heavy, sinking like stone into still water, rippling outward through Evelyn's chest. She raised her eyes to him, ready to speak, but his gaze had drifted far away, waiting for no answer, seeking no sympathy. It was as if he had spoken only to the fire, to the room itself, no longer to people. Evelyn held her silence. Instead of clumsy comfort, her eyes wandered across the dark wooden wall where several old frames hung, and there, she saw something that made her heart clench tight. A faded photograph, its frame worn, its glass coated with dust. Within it stood her parents in their youth, her mother's familiar smile, her father's steady shoulders, beside a soldier in uniform. Dark hair, a face unmarked by scars, eyes solemn yet steadfast. Evelyn caught her breath. It was Silas McKenna, younger, unbroken. The ground seemed to tilt beneath her. She tightened her hand on the spoon, her gaze locked on the image. A thread invisible had bound her life to his, long before she knew it. Silas had noticed her stare. His eyes flicked to the photograph, then back to her. He gave no explanation, no trace of surprise. His face was closed, like a door that no longer expected anyone to knock. "You knew my parents," Evelyn said at last, voice low but steady, not quite a question. Silas did not answer at once. He set his bowl down, leaned back in his chair, his eyes never leaving the fire. After a long silence, he gave a single nod. "I did." The brief reply opened a cavern in her chest. Memories stirred. She thought of winter nights in Iowa, her father by the table, telling stories of a young soldier he had once met, eyes sorrowful yet resolute. She had been too young to catch the details, only remembering how her father would fall quiet, smiling faintly, as though keeping part of the tale for himself. Evelyn sat rigid, her mind spinning. Why was the photograph here? Why were her parents frozen in memory beside this man, in this house? The room's silence grew so dense she could hear the hiss of sap in the burning logs. Questions pressed against her lips, but lodged there unspoken. At last she whispered, "I never thought you were not a stranger at all." Silas turned to her. In his eyes flickered something, not anger, not welcome, but the weary admission of a truth he had long hidden. He inclined his head, then rose and began to clear the dishes, closing the moment with his silence. Evelyn felt her hand tremble. His silence did not soothe her questions. It only sharpened them into flame. She sensed behind that photograph a larger story, a piece of her life that had been concealed. When Silas left for the kitchen, Evelyn stood and stepped close to the wall. Her fingertips brushed the dust from the frame. In the photograph, Silas stood straight, one hand resting on her father's shoulder. Even then, his eyes bore that same shadowed weight, as if burdened before the years had carved it deeper. She started when his voice came from behind her. "The past is nothing but the past, Miss Moore. In Red Hollow, no one cares who you were, only what scars you bear." Evelyn turned, meeting his eyes. In them lay both warning and unspoken grief. She drew a breath and let her hand fall from the frame. "But I care," she said quietly, holding his gaze. Silas stilled, as though caught off guard. He said nothing further, only pulled on his coat and moved for the door. She called after him without thought. "Where are you going?" "To check the stables after the rain," he said curtly. But she felt it was only an excuse, a way to flee the room heavy with memory. The door shut, leaving her alone. Evelyn looked back at the photograph, her chest tight. Something deep within told her the bond between her parents and Silas was no passing acquaintance. And that silver watch, the one her father had once pawned, was no accident in his hands. That night, back in her boarding room, Evelyn could not sleep. The rain had stopped, leaving only the whisper of wind, yet inside her heart the storm roared on. The photograph, her parents' faces, the unscarred Silas, all swirled together, refusing rest. She thought of Lucy's innocent voice calling her Evie May. She thought of the quiet look in Silas's eyes as he guided her across the dance floor. Strange fragments were knitting into shape, yet not enough to see clearly. One truth remained certain. Silas was no stranger. He was bound somehow to her family's story, to a chapter never told. And now she was compelled to uncover it, even if the answers would change how she saw herself. Moonlight rose high, laying silver across the ground. Evelyn sat at her small table, clutching her mother's worn Bible, whispering a prayer. Not for herself, but for the hollow gaze of Silas McKenna, that one day it might be filled with something other than darkness. The path behind Broken Bluff was carpeted with wild grass, turned pale and brittle. The afternoon sank into a thin veil of mist, the last shards of sunlight glimmering across raindrops clinging to the leaves like splinters of glass. Evelyn followed Silas, listening to the weight of his boots pressing into the damp earth. He spoke no word the whole way, and the silence made her heartbeat blend with the rustle of the old birches in the wind. At the crest of a low rise, the land opened into a small plot ringed by a simple wooden fence. A cemetery, no more than 10 graves, rough stones mottled with moss. Evelyn paused, drawing a deep breath. The air here was different, hushed, heavy, thick with memory, a place that made every step slow. Silas went straight to the stone in the center. He stood there, his shadow cast long across the grass. Evelyn drew near, and her eyes settled on the inscription. Sarah McKenna, beloved wife, 1848 to 1876. Her throat closed. The numbers spoke louder than words. A life ended in barely 2 short decades. Tiny fractures veined through the stone, webbed by years of weather. Silas remained still, his broad hand resting against the marker. The gesture was not dramatic, not desperate. Just a man refusing to let go of what remained, though it was only stone and cold earth. When his voice came, it was hoarse but steady, as though dragged from the deepest hollow of his chest. She died. In a fire. Kansas. An inn where we stopped on the way west. I thought I could protect her, but the flames spread too fast. By the time I broke the door, the room was already hell. I carry these scars from that night, and from that night, everything burned with her. Evelyn stood still, the wind whipping her hair. She saw in his eyes not emptiness, but a wound that had never healed. The man the town called scarred was only a survivor of loss, too vast to name. She stepped closer, laying a hand gently on his arm. The lightest touch, but it startled him, as though tenderness had long been foreign. "They say many things," Evelyn whispered, her voice trembling. "They call you dangerous, a wife killer. But now I know those are only cruel lies." Silas did not answer at once. His gaze stayed on the stone, his broad shoulders quivering. He drew a long breath. "Rumor outlives truth, Miss Moore. It clings to a man and grows, until it smothers all else. I have no strength left to fight it, so I let it be. But sometimes I wonder, if Sarah still lived, what would she think of the names they give me?" Evelyn's eyes blurred. Tears fell unbidden, not only for Sarah, a woman she had never known, but for the man before her who bore the weight of all that was taken. He was no monster, no shadow, only a man hollowed by one night's fire, hiding inside his scars while the world spun its stories. She murmured, "If Sarah truly loved you, she would never let those lies define you. And I believe she did love you." His eyes closed briefly, as though her words touched a place long withered. When he opened them, they met hers, no longer indifferent, but trembling faintly, as if hearing something he dared not believe, yet yearned to. They stood a long while with only the wind and the dry grass whispering. Evelyn bent and plucked a wild violet from the fence line, laying it gently on the grave. "I did not know Sarah," she said, "but if I could, I would want her to know she is remembered through you, and that this grief is no longer yours alone." Silas turned his face aside, but Evelyn saw the blur of light in his eyes. His hand clenched, knuckles white. A breath shuddered loose. "Folks see only the scars," he repeated, voice breaking. "Never what I lost." Evelyn answered softly, firmly, "I see, Silas. I see." The words hung like a thread, fragile but enough to stitch some piece of him back together. No transformation, no sudden change, but in his eyes flickered the faintest flame, the kind that fights to live when shielded from the wind. The sky tilted toward dusk, the last light burning orange across the little graveyard. Evelyn knew she had touched a door Silas had long kept barred, and she felt, somehow, that her place in Red Hollow was no accident. As they left the cemetery, their steps slowed, the tension eased. She walked beside him, not needing words, letting this silence carry new meaning, the silence of understanding. And in her heart, one certainty took root. The town's whispers were nothing but smoke. The truth of Silas and his loss had begun to show. And perhaps from here, the work of healing for them both had truly begun. As they left the graveyard, Evelyn felt the distance between herself and Silas had narrowed, no longer shrouded in the cold mist it once bore. Dusk gathered, wind stirring through the birch trees, sending their dry leaves scattering. The scent of damp earth lingered in the air after the afternoon storm. They walked in silence until Silas stopped beneath an old oak, where the fading light lay broken across its rough bark. Slowly, he reached inside his black duster and drew out a familiar object, the silver watch Evelyn had first glimpsed when she arrived in Red Hollow. It caught the dim glow, its surface scratched, but still carrying the proud shape of something once cherished. Silas turned it in his hand, his rough fingers brushing across the worn engraving. "This," he said at last, his words falling heavy as stone, "was never mine. It never belonged to me." Evelyn lifted her eyes, following every movement of his hand. Silas drew a deep breath. The night the fire consumed the inn in Kansas, I thought I would die there. Smoke thick as iron, heat roaring in every beam. I ran through it, screaming Sarah's name, but her door was locked, and the flames were already higher than my head. I had no way left, until a man threw himself inside. Evelyn's breath caught. He dragged me from the wreckage, Silas said, voice breaking low. When I was slipping into darkness, he pressed this watch into my hand. He spoke only one line. If you live, carry this as a promise. Begin again, for what was lost. Then he turned back inside. Silas paused, eyes far away. I never saw him come out. Later I learned it was your father. The words struck like thunder. Evelyn pressed her hand to her chest, heart pounding wild. Memory surged. Her father, thin yet strong, eyes kind but worn by Iowa winters. She remembered the day he left, saying it was for work, and the night he returned with blistered hands and a hollow gaze she was too young to understand. My father, she whispered hoarsely. He was there. With you? Silas nodded slowly. He saved me, and he paid with his life. He held the silver watch out toward her. It should have been yours, not mine. Her hand trembled as she took it. The cold metal burned against her palm, heavy with a past entwined with hers. The scratches across its face were like old wounds, a record of a promise never fulfilled. Tears streaked her cheeks as she murmured, For years I blamed him. I thought he had abandoned us, left my mother and me to hardship. But all along, he saved you. Silas bowed his head, voice dropping to a graveled tone. I lived. Sarah did not. I carry the scars, but he gave me the chance to keep walking. This watch, it reminds me I owe a life. I owe a family. And for years I have not known how to pay it back. Evelyn closed her hand around the watch and sat at the foot of the oak. She looked up at him, eyes raw with both sorrow and understanding. You already have, Silas. You've kept it. You've carried it. That means you never forgot. My father was not a man who asked for thanks. For him, that might have been enough. Silas shook his head, shadowed still. I told myself the same. But when I saw you in Red Hollow, chalk in your hand, smiling at those children, I knew the debt was not gone. You are his daughter, and your presence brought the promise back to life. Evelyn tightened her grip on the watch. The last light of sunset glinted on its silver, throwing a glow that felt ancient, almost sacred. Her voice slipped soft as wind. Perhaps he wanted you to find yourself, and to find something else too, something you thought was lost. They sat in silence, the wind rushing through the branches above. Evelyn studied the watch in her palm, as though it were a thread binding past to present. Do you ever think, she asked, that some people cross our lives only to hand us a chance, and then vanish? Silas nodded faintly. I think of it every day, and now, standing before you, I know I cannot waste that chance again. Evelyn met his gaze. In those storm-gray eyes, she saw no longer only loneliness, but the beginning of resolve. Not vengeance, not isolation, but a man bent on redemption. She placed the watch back into his hand, shaking her head when he tried to refuse. Keep it. He entrusted it to you. And if you mean to repay him, then live a different life. Not for him, not for me, for yourself. A gust tore through the trees, lifting the gold leaves into the air. Silas clutched the watch, his fingers shaking. For the first time in years, his eyes held not only shadow, but the faint shimmer of belief. Evelyn rose, brushing mud from her dress. My father chose to trust you in his last moment. I will choose the same. But Silas, don't let that choice be wasted. He looked at her as though engraving each word into his memory. Slowly, Silas nodded. That evening, as they returned toward Broken Bluff, Evelyn felt it clear. The invisible thread between them had tightened. Not just curiosity, not just the glance of lantern light at a festival, but a secret carried from the past that bound their lives together. And as the final light of dusk bled away, Evelyn knew, from that silver watch, another beginning was waiting for them both. In the days that followed their talk beneath the old oak, the fragile quiet surrounding Evelyn and Silas could no longer hold. Red Hollow was a small town, where even a glance shared in a crowd or a step slowed along the street could swell into endless tale spinning. The whispers had begun at the Harvest Festival, when Silas McKenna, the man closed off as stone, had surprised everyone by offering the new school teacher from Iowa a waltz. And now, for those who had seen them walking side by side, the rumors spread like fire to dry grass. At the saloon, men tapped their glasses and muttered, "She must be the first to stand near him without trembling." In the market, women selling produce scoffed, "A man like him, could he even keep a family?" And the children, wide-eyed, passed along a tale that their teacher had been taken to the big house at Broken Bluff. Evelyn heard the murmur more than once as she walked the streets. At first she quickened her pace, shoulders squared, feigning deafness. But each whispered barb, each sidelong glance pricked her skin like hidden thorns. That evening, as the sun slanted across weathered shingles, Evelyn returned to Margaret Keene's boarding house. The widow, long familiar with small-town gossip, did not choose silence this time. The moment Evelyn entered, her face grew stern, and she spoke plainly, without circling. "Child, in this town, rumor carries more weight than truth. If the two of you keep on this way, folks won't let it rest. Best to settle the talk with an engagement." Evelyn froze, her cheeks burning. The words dropped into the quiet kitchen like a stone breaking glass. She faltered, unable to speak. An engagement? Simply to smother gossip? Margaret poured hot water into the teapot, her voice even yet firm. "I'm not speaking of love. I'm speaking of honor. You're a teacher, and you must keep the respect of parents. And Silas, he's half feared, half wondered at. If his name were tied to yours by a promise, folks would have no room left to pick at you." Evelyn sank into a wooden chair, hands clasped tight. Margaret was not one to build talk from nothing. Her words came from years of surviving in a town where reputation was as thin as thread. Yet how could Evelyn agree to such a binding step when her heart had not even found its own name for what it felt? That night she could not sleep. She sat by the window, gazing into the moonlit yard, the widow's words circling in her head. Engagement. A binding. A label meant to choke rumor. But marriage, to Evelyn, could never be a shield alone. It must come of trust, of choice freely made by two hearts. The next morning, Silas came for her. He stood at the boarding house steps, tall and silent as ever, hand resting lightly on the brim of his hat. Evelyn stepped out, turmoil inside her, unsure of what to say. But it was Silas who broke the silence. "They talk plenty," he said softly, only for her ears. "But instead of hiding behind walls, Maybe we turn it into something useful. Would you make Broken Bluff into a schoolhouse? Evelyn's eyes widened. She had braced for a question of engagement, of honor, of saying yes or no before the whole town. But no, Silas spoke not of marriage nor of appearances. He spoke of children, of learning, of filling a house with voices instead of dust. In that moment, Evelyn felt her heart steady. His question pulled her clear of the tangle of rumor. It did not demand a choice beyond her reach. It opened a road tied to the reason she had come to Red Hollow at all: to teach, to give children a chance. You truly mean that? She asked, voice trembling. Silas nodded, eyes fixed on hers. That house was empty of laughter. If you'll bring the laughter of children there, perhaps that will be the surest way to silence them. Evelyn did not answer at once. She looked down at his rough hands, scarred and weathered, and thought, perhaps he was right. Folks might weave stories, but when they saw a true school rising in that house, they would fall quiet. That evening, as the last light poured across the rooftops, Evelyn sat again with Margaret. The widow asked bluntly, "What did he say?" Evelyn hesitated, then answered, "He didn't speak of engagement. He wants to turn his house into a school." Margaret's eyes widened briefly, then softened into a faint smile. "Then that is good. Perhaps he understands more than I reckoned. But remember, child, a school can be built anew, but a heart, you alone must decide for that." That night, Evelyn lay on her narrow bed, moonlight spilling across the floor. Her heart pulled between two poles: rumor and truth, engagement and a schoolhouse, honor and the heart. Yet amid the tangle, for the first time, she felt a spark, a fragile hope that life in Red Hollow might be more than sharp stares and whispers. It might yet become a home for learning, and for something gentler still. That whole day, Evelyn kept herself busy among her pupils, yet in her chest burned a quiet flame. Each time their eyes lit when solving a sum, or their shy voices rose to read halting lines, her thoughts strayed to the empty house at Broken Bluff, where Silas had asked softly, "Would you make it a school?" That question had not merely suggested an idea, it had sown in her the belief that there were paths beyond fighting rumor head-on. By dusk, Evelyn walked the main street of Red Hollow. Greetings mingled with whispers, as they always did. But this time she did not bow her head. She thought, if she held steady, the whispers would fade like wind through pines. What mattered was not what they said, but how she chose to live. That evening, Silas came to the boarding house. He did not knock hard, only lightly, as though wary of waking someone. When Evelyn opened the door, his eyes shone in the lamplight, not fierce, not urgent, only waiting. And then Evelyn nodded. It was not for a hasty betrothal, not for the fragile notion of honor Margaret Keene feared would be lost. It was a nod for a shared hearth, a place where desks and slates might be set, where children could sit and learn. A nod to a house no longer haunted by loss, but filled instead with laughter. Silas answered not with grand words. He only searched her gaze as if to be certain. Then, slowly, he held out his hand. Evelyn placed hers in his, a scarred hand, yet warm, carrying enough strength to let her believe she had chosen rightly. The next morning, they began to ready the empty rooms of Broken Bluff. The dust-thick chamber that once held a child's cradle was thrown open to sunlight. Evelyn, with the help of her older pupils, swept floors and set desks brought by the carpenter. Upon the wall where an old photograph still hung, Evelyn asked that it remain, as a reminder that the past need not be erased, only set alongside the new. Word ran swift through Red Hollow. Silas McKenna's house was to be the new school. People gossiped, some scoffed, some sighed. Yet when they saw children come running, clutching books, faces glowing with joy, the rumors began to lose their bite. Parents once wary started sending their little ones. In time, the hum of study drowned the idle talk. Through those days of work, Evelyn saw a different Silas. He spoke little, but his eyes softened whenever children filled the room. One day a boy stumbled and fell, bursting into tears. Silas stepped forward without pause, lifted him gently, brushed off the dirt, and set him back in his chair. To Evelyn, the sight echoed their first meeting in the square, when he had lifted a wounded girl and returned her to her mother. That winter night, after a long day of labor, Evelyn and Silas sat by the hearth in the house now turned schoolroom. Wind clawed at the shutters, but the fire crackled warmly, painting both their faces in amber light. Evelyn turned to see Silas staring into the flames. Wordless, she whispered, voice trembling yet sure, "I did not find a perfect man, but I found a heart that longs to protect and to be forgiven." Silas turned, his storm-gray eyes glinting with something new, surprise and release. He said nothing. He only clasped her hand tightly, holding as if letting go would undo it all. And then, for the first time in years, his lips curved into a true smile, a smile no longer hidden behind walls of pain, but born of trust, of beginning. Outside, snow had begun to fall, each white flake settling soft on the roof. Red Hollow lay hushed, but inside the little house, two souls, long marked by loss, had found something stronger still: hope. Perhaps at any age we long to see a genuine smile return after years of silence. And when Evelyn whispered that she had not found perfection, but a heart that seeks both protection and forgiveness, it was a reminder for us all. Love and kindness hold the power to quiet every wound. If this story has stirred some memory or faith in you, dear listener, we invite you to share it in the comments below. And don't forget to like and subscribe so that together we can keep such gentle stories alive for our time and for the generations yet to come.